Traits were never born with their hosts. Instead, they were assigned. When a child was brought into the world, a unique combination of 4 main traits was appointed to them for the entirety of their lives, creating each individual's personality. The passing of the host, however, would return said traits to the astral plane, where they would wait for reassignment, and the cycle would repeat. The traits themselves were immortal, but the longer they lived, the darker they became, and as time went by, they would develop a much harsher outlook on life. All of them knew the quote, "You either die a hero or live long enough to watch yourself become the villain," which summed up the aging process of a trait surprisingly well, even though their immortality made it impossible for them to die. Unfortunately, it meant that they would all eventually become the villain, so to speak. Using that order, it made sense that morality was the youngest phase, which started when a trait turned 21, followed closely by creativity. The creative stage started after a trait had had 3 hosts, and they would remain that way until the 8th human they were a part of passed on. Then, once they became logical, they were required to have another 10 hosts before they would fall into the inevitable darkness that each would become. That was the final, longest, and worst part of their immortal lives, when they finally became a negative trait, overall disgusted with life. There was one way to prevent such a fate, but it was an honor that was rarely bestowed upon any, to say the least. Some of the alignments of the moral, creative, logical, and negative sides worked better together than most others, and that would result in a particularly fulfilling and selfless life for the human they were a part of. This allowed the trait to be granted the gift of Elysium by the Council of the Astral Plane, and when the traits reached the perfect haven that was Elysium, their aging process would come to a halt, and they would be permitted to live the rest of eternity in peace. If the 4 sides failed, when the person passed on, their soul would go to the fields of Asphodel, and the traits would simply be paired off in a different alignment, and they would be assigned to another child. They would be given a way to remember the one they had lost, however, a symbolic mark that was comprised of elements that had been instrumental in the life of, or important to the human they would never see again. The more the host had meant to them, the closer to the heart the mark would be, sometimes seeming like an open wound, as it reminded them of the grief they felt. Patton, Roman, Logan, and Virgil had grown particularly close, not only to their host, Thomas, who had been one of the few people to ever be aware of his traits, but to one another as well, considering the other 3 to be family, which was uncommon in most assignments. It was interesting that the online personality had used the videos he made to help them come to a better understanding with one another, without knowing what would happen to any of them later down the line. Not only that, but the same videos influenced him, his followers, and those around him to be better people, and make the world a better place. Days, months, and years passed by in a blur, and before they could all process what had happened, one by one, the sides came to the heartbreaking conclusion that the time they had left with Thomas was limited. Eventually, he was hospitalized, and each of them struggled with the knowledge that he would never return home, and the traits themselves would soon be separated, with great odds of never seeing one another again. The thought caused emotions to run high, and they all channeled them differently. Patton spent most of his days in tears, and Logan grew quiet, hardly speaking a word to anyone. Virgil, as the eldest, had been through the process the most, and took up a position of trying to console the others, despite his own grief and worry, which showed clearly behind his eyes, and Roman searched desperately for a way to grant them all more time. As the weeks passed, they learned when the doctors and other staff would come by, and the 4 of them would sit with Thomas in between rounds. His family and friends' previous knowledge of them proved to be a blessing, seeing as that allowed them to visit the real world, even when they were present. More than once, despite this advantage, Logan or Virgil had been forced to take Patton back to the mindscape when he began sobbing hysterically. It was also decided, for the safety of not being discovered, that he couldn't stay with their host alone. Sadly, they knew his emotions would cloud his judgment, and at a time of crisis, he would not leave if he heard the doctors coming, so someone else had to be there to drag him away, if need be. The prince, on the other hand, did his best to not let what he felt show, but on multiple occasions he had left the bedside of the YouTuber, cheeks wet with tears. Then there was Virgil, who had difficulty sleeping at the best of times, so he elected to stay with their host through the night, permitting the others to try and get some rest. To everyone's dismay, Thomas slowly became less responsive, to the point that he was unable to acknowledge the presence of even his own sides. Then, after a few more agonizing weeks, with family and friends gathered around, they all heard it. The single, high-pitched, unbroken tone from one of the machines, which indicated the lack of a heartbeat. Morality immediately started sobbing, clinging to Logic, whose professionalism was momentarily forgotten as tears sparkled in his own sorrow-filled eyes. Princey placed his head in his hands, as a last attempt to hide the flood of grief which caused his shoulders to shake. But when he glanced up for just a second, he locked eyes with anxiety, and saw his own pain mirrored there. The family in the room broke away to get those who were absent, and the four traits took their opportunity. With hushed goodbyes, they synced out of the real world, bidding farewell to the best host they had ever had the honor to serve. Despite knowing what came next, each of them was taken by surprise when they didn't reappear in the mindscape. Instead, they stood before the Council of the Ethereal Planes. They were given no time to react, as a female voice chimed from above them, and Roman wondered how anyone could be so cheery on the eve of such a tragedy.
In accordance with our laws, you will be granted the customary 6 months to mourn your loss before the time of your reassignment. We apologize for any hardships or negative feelings that this most recent event has inflicted, and we hope you readjust well to your lives in the astral plane.
The prince could feel his blood boiling, as the shallow-sounding words were said in her joyous tone. It actually took all of his power to keep his mouth shut, as she moved back to join her colleagues. These were traits who would never experience the trauma that they were going through. The next to step forward was a man dressed in the dark robes that marked the leader of the council, theoretically the most respected person in all of the astral plane, and that was the reason he held his tongue. Unlike the woman, he didn't carry himself with a light and carefree demeanor. There was sympathy in his eyes, but his voice remained professional and authoritative.
We know that this loss has touched all of you deeply, more so than any before.
He paused, and it wasn't until the speaker locked eyes with him that Roman realized the glare he gave the council leader, but he didn't shift his gaze. Eventually, the one standing above them looked away, maintaining his calm integrity.
Understanding the relationship you held with this host, the symbolic mark he leaves upon you rests as near to the heart as it can, just below your left collarbone.
Each of them pulled gingerly at their shirts, and for a few seconds they were left in awed silence, but it was broken when a sob escaped Patton's lips. His knees buckled, and all three of the others jumped to catch him, but Virgil was the nearest, and braced his friend with his shoulder. The tattoo that each of them now bore was done in an array of colors, but it was still clearly the YouTube symbol, the outline structured like a molecule, with both ionic and covalent bonds. The three main components representing Thomas's sexuality, love for chemistry, and the talent he had shared on the video website. The sides weren't allotted much time to process this newest development, before being dismissed by a few nods from the council members. As they were ushered away, the prince dared to shoot one last glare at the leader. He didn't care about the respect most showed him. All he could think of was how this person had said he understood their relationship with Thomas when he'd never even met him. He didn't know what he expected in return, but the shadowed look of concern he cast at the floor certainly wasn't it. But they were separated as the doors shut between them. A moment later, they were faced with the doors to their apartments, all of which just so happened to be next door to one another, in the order of their age. But none of that stunned them. The astral plane was able to morph and shift, meaning it was not uncommon for any place the council needed to magically become closer at their will. Virgil exchanged small, tear-blurred glances with the other three as soon as their escorts left them, and wordlessly they walked to their separate apartments. He had been back to the astral plane so many times that he had actually grown accustomed to his temporary home there, even if he only lived in it for 6 months at a time. That being the case, he still found himself longing to be back in his room in Thomas's mind palace. Shaking his head to clear it, anxiety timidly opened the door, flicking on the lights. To say that he was astonished would have been a massive understatement. In times past, his apartment had changed slightly to accommodate the changes in his personality or interests that he had picked up during assignment, but never before had it altered itself to be anything like this. What sat before him now in no way resembled his old apartment, and instead was a perfect replica of his room from Thomas's mindscape. He couldn't hear his footsteps as he cautiously moved inside, ensuring that the door latched firmly behind him. It actually sickened him to see and even interact with such a perfect recreation without it being the real thing. What made it worse was that he so desperately wanted to believe he was back in his room. He could almost hear Patton downstairs making dinner, or the music of a Disney movie echoing from Princey's room. It wasn't until he had made his way over to the desk in the corner that he found the black notebook with all of his notes on the other's sleepwalking habits, that he realized the trap he was allowing himself to fall into. Despite not having grown so close to a host in millennia, Virgil knew that he needed to put his grief aside so he could help the others and be in the correct frame of mind at the start of his reassignment, understanding that the only way to prepare himself would be to distance all memories from his mind, especially those he was fond of. Anxiety aimlessly tossed his book in the trash, but the familiar numbness of grief evaporated as his eyes rested on the object that turned his determination into a sorrow-fueled, unbridled rampage. Suddenly, the picture that had no business being in the astral plane was resting in his hands, and only served to sadden him further. In the photo, the floor in his room was easily identified by the dark carpet, and on it, 4 figures sat in a circle, and on Morality's cardigan-clad shoulder sat a black kitten, his kitten, Amaya. The feelings he had from the recent loss of his host and the looming separation of his family was only intensified by the reminder of a friend whose death he had already mourned. In a moment of blind fury, he threw the picture with as much force as he could muster, and as it shattered against the far wall, shaking another frame free of its hook, which fell to the ground with an equally loud crash. The grief and anger obscured the minutes that followed, and he could only remember bits and pieces of his quest to make the apartment look as different as possible. Drawers were pulled from their places, their contents scattered on the floor, as wood splintered under the force of the impact, with the sounds of breaking glass and plastic thankfully overpowering any sobs that escaped him. Somewhere behind the agony and heartache, in the depths of his subconscious, Virgil knew that this would be the only reprieve he could allow himself. All too soon the others would need his reserved manner and experience with death as a means of emotional support. But for now, with his room in shambles, he stumbled over to the bed. Cleaning the covers of any debris that had managed to land there, he collapsed into the soft surface, expecting the tears to return, but none came forth. After all the destruction, he merely felt numb, his ears ringing, and his vision faded in and out with what looked like television static. Of the hundreds of hosts he'd had, none had ever left the eldest of the 4 in such a frayed mental state. Normally, he could just move on and ignore what he felt, but it was different this time. In the past, he had been able to almost, if not completely, forget about the existence of those he had previously been a part of, and the ones he had worked with. But this time, there was no denying the pain. Thomas had been special, and not only to him. He had been the only one to ever take notice of them, and he had done his best to amend their rough relations. Once the sides had figured out just how much he cared for them, they had tried to reciprocate by doing what they could to help him through his own dilemmas. Anxiety tried to clear his mind, because while he suffered through what felt like hell, he could only imagine how Patton and Roman were coping. He didn't know exactly how many hosts they'd had, but by trait standards, they were still young, and without experience. The whole process had to be harder for them. He still worried about Logan, but he wasn't as emotional as the other 2, making it a bit easier for him to rationalize his way through the situation. Virgil was drawn from his thoughts as a soft knocking echoed from the door, and with his current mindset, it didn't surprise him that he hadn't heard anyone approaching. Taking a deep breath, he got to his feet, and seeing as it was more likely the youngest of the others waiting for him in the corridor, he needed to pull himself together. His room, however, would be a clear indicator of the mental break he'd just suffered, and as he stepped over what had once been a bookshelf, remorse stabbed at him like an icy dagger. Maybe he shouldn't have been so quick to destroy his apartment, but there was no taking it back now. Logan had been stunned when he stepped into his apartment. He had returned to the astral plane after 17 different assignments, but never before had his temporary home fully taken on the appearance of his room from a host's mind. He abhorred emotion, but he couldn't deny the anguish that seared at him like someone had set his chest on fire as he took in the details of the area. There was one object, though, that drew his attention over everything else. Logic didn't have the faintest clue as to how it had ended up in his apartment, but in the corner of his room was the Celestron 60 EQ power seeker that Virgil had given him so many years ago. Resting his hand on the optical tube, he thought of the memories intertwined with the object, even with anxiety's original misgivings on the idea. Years later, the two of them had eventually told the others the story behind the scope. As it turned out, no one had made fun of him, or been overly sappy about it. Instead, they had chosen to partake in, and came to love the same astronomical activities. The thoughts of the star parties they had shared nearly brought tears to his eyes once more, because he knew the number of days, and chances of similar moments with his family were limited. In an attempt to return to his rational mindset, he turned away from the scientific instrument. But a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror across the room brought Logan to a standstill. For a brief moment, he didn't recognize the person staring back at him. His skin had become paler, his hair, eyes, and clothes darker. He wasn't standing as straight, and his shoulders were hunched forward slightly. At first he put it off to the major change in his life, thinking that it had shaken him more than he'd previously thought. But the chill that ran down his spine disproved his hypothesis. Logic was horrified that a change had slipped his mind, but it helped to explain the difficulties he was having with keeping his emotions in check. He would only be assigned to one more host before he would change phase once again. Still overwhelmed, he moved to sit on the edge of his bed, thoughts running through his mind as he placed his head in his hands. He wondered what kind of negative trait he would become. Would he be anxious, like Virgil? He couldn't imagine being so fearful all the time, though. Perhaps he would be a depressed side. A long time ago he had worked with such a trait, but the idea of being so dismal all the time was no more appealing. As it was, Logan quite liked who he was presently, but then again, had he not felt the same when he had been in the moral and creative stages of his life? Still, he knew the only way to handle the fear was to live one day at a time, and worry about who he would become when he reached that point. The plan of action offered him some relief, but he was unable to relish in it for long when two equally loud crashes sounded from the other side of the hall. A barrage of destructive noises, from splintering wood to cracking plastic, echoed from the room next to his, and left him to wonder who was causing them, and why. It wasn't until a muffled scream rippled through the air that he understood exactly what was happening. He had no idea how old Virgil was, but there was no way he would keep going if he truly remembered and mourned every host he'd had, which more than likely meant that the perfect recreation of his room infuriated him. It was extremely probable that he thought the only way he could get the distance he needed from his memories of Thomas was by destroying everything he could to get away from them. If that was what he felt was the best course of action, then that was his choice, but logic decided he would still go and check on his colleague after all the noises had stopped. Logan waited for the shatters and bangs to cease, and even when they did, he allowed his friend a few more minutes to compose himself. Counting the seconds by tapping his leg, he finally got to the point where he could no longer justify sitting idly by, and stood to go and help anxiety. It wasn't until he had already knocked on the door that he realized the one in question wouldn't appreciate being, for the lack of a better term, mothered. That meant he had less than 20 seconds to come up with an excuse for why he was seeking his colleague's attention. When the threshold opened to him, he couldn't help but notice the shock and concern that crossed Virgil's expression, before being swiftly replaced with the same solemn responsibility he had been upholding for months. He knew the quick lapse of emotion pertained to Logic's own change in appearance, but he did not address it.
I know you probably don't want anyone bothering you right now.
He struggled to come up with a reason for his visit.
I didn't want to come and get you myself, but we are probably the only ones who can put aside our emotions for the time being.
Anxiety raised one eyebrow, looking unconvinced by his words.
Patton and Roman, however, may not fare as well in our current situation.
The claim wasn't entirely a lie. He was genuinely concerned about the others, but he had no idea how he was going to help them with their feelings. A nod was the only response Virgil gave him, before wordlessly stepping out of the wreck that was his apartment. They moved to the nearest door, and Logan made a point to stand up taller and keep his shoulders back, but he still knew there was something off about his stature. He just had to hope that without the perceptive skills that the one next to him had, they would not notice, and if they did, they would also keep it to themselves. 4 swift knocks were soon answered, as Patton peered out of his apartment, the redness of his face and eyes betraying that he had been in tears since they had last seen one another. When he realized who was seeking his attention, he opened the door a little further.
Hey kiddos, what you need?
Logic looked to the one in the corridor with him for a response, and after a quick glance, he turned back to Morality.
We wanted to check in on you before doing the same for Roman.
Logan paused briefly, as if he were searching for how to continue.
Perhaps it would be best if you went ahead and joined. Then the four of us could go get something to eat.
Patton stepped out into the hall, giving them a half-hearted smile.
Thanks, kids. Now, let's go get Roman.